Welcome to What I've Learned, the podcast which talks to child protection practitioners in development and humanitarian settings about community-led approaches. If you're a practitioner who's trying to find ways to strengthen community ownership of child protection, or perhaps you're just interested in learning more, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Lucy Hillier. I'm a child protection advisor living in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I focus on participatory and community-led approaches for child protection. As part of this, I run an initiative called the Community Child Protection Exchange, which develops innovative ways to help practitioners build their skills as facilitators of a community-led approach. Each episode, I talk with an expert from the child protection world, and we hear about their unique experience of community-led child protection and what they've learned along the way. We talk to academics and researchers, program advisors and field staff from all over the globe and discuss real-life examples of how different communities have led their own child protection. In this episode, we talk to Juan José Castellanos Piedrahita, a Colombian child protection practitioner currently working for War Child Holland. We hear about an inspiring child protection program with a displaced indigenous rural community who now live in the town of Quibdó in a department called Chocó in the Pacific region of Colombia. We talk about how a traditional protection mechanism used by this community for many decades was broadened to include a specific child protection role. And we also learn about how the community empowered itself to undertake a number of other child protection actions of their own. This is a truly fascinating account of a community-led child protection program, and I hope it can provide some inspiration and guidance to any of you who are trying to implement a similar approach.
They will be the ones who will find the solution, and there's going to be a solution from the community. It just takes time, so trust the process and don't get too impatient. That they empowered themselves more than we empowered them. It wasn't us the ones who were empowering them, it was themselves working through this process.
I'm really happy to have Juan José on the program today because he's been testing out a community-led approach in a number of diverse communities in Colombia and has absolutely loads of learning to share with us. Today, he's going to tell us about working with a displaced indigenous community in the Western Colombian department of Chocó. We'll be taking a deep dive into how War Child Holland has worked with this particular community, including how they've really taken the time to learn with community members and how a program like this can be sustainable. So with that, welcome, Juan José.
Thank you, Lucy. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, thanks for taking the time to speak to me today. And yeah, like I said, I'm really excited. There's lots of learning that you've got that I would really, really like to share with other people who are trying to implement a community-led approach. So maybe before we get into the specifics of all the work you've been involved in Colombia, can you maybe just tell us, Juan José, what led you down this path of working in a community-led way?
Okay, so it has been both a personal, academic, but also a pathway throughout the sector, or through the humanitarian sector. So I worked at a child protection institution in Colombia for a couple of years. So from the government's program on child protection, on institutionalized care. I have also worked at child protection programs from national NGOs, which are more community-based and also had a link with arts and sports. The first time I heard about community-led child protection was in 2020 when I joined War Child almost 3 years now. Discussions within our child protection team and also readings of academic documents or papers from, for example, Mike Wessels have helped me to understand what this approach was about, and also the support from Rinske, our research and development person from this approach. Rinske is the lead researcher from our community-led child protection methodology, which is SEEDS. which we share with Save the Children, international also, where we have had many enriching discussions, learning, and developments of this methodology, amazing methodology. Also, another thing which is interesting is I have, since I was a university student, I have been very interested in community work. My first internships, I did it with at community level organizations. And I felt that this approach had a connection with how these organizations, how Latin American organizations were thinking about achieving social change. So I saw links with popular education, and I also saw links with participatory action research. And furthermore, I started learning about feminisms and global South development theories, which showed and made me understand that the more communal and organic a process is, the more that it is likely to achieve social change, at changing social norms or institution.
Thanks, Juan Jose. Oh, and I wanted to ask you, so obviously South America has a very deep connection and history to some really progressive theories around power and education. I'm thinking of Paulo Freire, even the what they call forum theater of Augusto Boal. So has that also kind of did that influence you at university, and does that influence you still now?
It has influenced me. I think both Paulo Freire, popular education, on how to get critical thinking and doing research in your own community to change the issues or problems that are happening in the communities is one of the main things that have influenced me. And also, of course, Orlando Falls-Borda participatory action research, which is pretty close to the way we work in a community-led process.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for reminding me about Falls-Borda. I remember reading him at university. So we're kind of continuing this journey of this kind of thinking, and here we are in 2023. So I think maybe let's maybe get more into the detail of what it is that you've come to talk to us about today. You've come to talk to us about a community-led child protection initiative. It's in Colombia. Can you first just tell us a little bit about the context, where it is, who are these people, and those kinds of just more contextual information?
Sure, Lucy. So for this community, it's more a protracted crisis type setting. So it is a community which has been displaced due to the armed conflict in Colombia. Have received some humanitarian assistance, and now are located in Quibdó, Chocó, which is the Pacific of Colombia. It is one of the most vulnerable departments, and Quibdó one of the most vulnerable cities in the country. So this community is part of an indigenous group. There are around 87 indigenous groups in Colombia, which are recognized by the government, and although national organizations recognize at least 102 indigenous communities. For context, most of those indigenous groups speak different languages. So we have 65 indigenous languages in the country, out of 69 that we have as a country as a whole, including Afro-Colombian communities and Rom communities. So these communities are specifically part of the indigenous group Waunan, which is mostly located in the Pacific of Colombia. It is located in this department, Chocó. Lots of communities to the south, some communities to the northern part. This community was displaced in the 90s, and they settled down in this place, which initially was an illegal settlement close to the northern part of Quibdó. And very close to a very complicated neighborhood due to violence, presence of armed groups, armed organization, criminal organizations, and all these things. This community, just to mention another things from the context, they do not have access to all public services, to all services. So they do not have access to water and sanitation, for example, for instance. They do have access to energy, but it is not the most stable service. Not in Quibdó as a city as a whole, and less in this community. It is a small community, so there is around from 130 to 150 people. They settled, as I said, in the 90s. This community tried to establish themselves in a traditional way that the Waunan communities used to establish. So they try to have a traditional meeting place, which is not the same as it will be if they were living in their traditional community, but they try to resemble it. They live in wooden houses, small wooden houses, in a traditional way of living. This community used to be hunter-gatherers, so they still try to gather some crops and to also try to hunt some animals because they're pretty close to the tropical forest and a pretty small river that is in this location that they are now. People in this community usually make their living working in the town. So in Quibdó, they are not used to having stable jobs. Informality in this city is pretty big. So they live on a day-to-day basis. They work as recycling people, they work as domestic workers, or they work in stores and these kind of things that are still in Quibdó, but they do not have access to stable jobs most of the times. And there's an important thing to mention here, and it's that they have been recognized as a place in need of humanitarian assistance since 2020 from an emergency consortia here in Colombia, which is called MIRE. So just to close it around the context, it is a very vulnerable community, and they are exposed to violence and other risks, which are common to Quibdó, but more common to this northern part of Quibdó.
Thanks. So it's a very small community, but a very vulnerable one. So maybe building on this, the children, how did you sort of get to know about the children here and the challenges that they're facing? And what are those challenges?
Right. So as I said, there was a report in 2020 from an emergency consortium here in Colombia. They mentioned it there that there were some risks associated to child protection, but were not too specific. We were just starting our project, the project which this implementation is related to at that year. And we were strengthening our relationships with ethnic organizations and also with victims organizations in the department. So when we strengthened our relationship and we started talking to them more, to those organizations, they were continuously mentioning Villanueva. They were mentioning that there was a need to do a child protection intervention. They had a small school, but they didn't have many services or child protection response, mostly focused on emergency aid, but not more of a sustainable process. So that's how we got to this community. That's how we learned about the risks. And the first time we went there was actually to start speaking to the community. We first had some meetings with the leaders. Then we asked them that we needed to have a meeting with a bigger participation of the community to decide if this was an approach that they will all want to be part of. So that is also very important. And also just to mention something more around the risks, there's a high risk of forced recruitment, or how we say it, or association with armed forces or armed groups in this city, in Quibdó, and especially in this place because it's very close to the northern part of the city, which is sadly has presence and control actually by armed groups and armed organizations, of course, illegal ones linked to drug trafficking, but also which are still part of the political armed conflict in Colombia, which is still going on.
So a very challenging environment for children to grow up in. And Juan Jose, I think you told me something earlier, which I thought was interesting. You told me that there was a rise in suicide rate reported generally amongst indigenous communities. And it seemed to be young people who were mostly being, how do we say it? They were young people who were mostly the ones who are suicidal. Is that something that you know about in this particular community, or the Wunan people?
Just in general, the Waunan or the Embera communities in Chocó are very concerned about this issue. Actually, the traditional authorities are concerned or are continuously telling INGOs or national NGOs about this issue. There is not a clear understanding around why is there a rise in suicides, especially in adolescents and youth. There are some hypotheses, and I want to be clear that this is not this is not the reason why it's happening. But it's just some hypotheses that we have discussed with other organizations and also with traditional authorities and spiritual leaders from these organizations. So basically, they are worried that there's some problems and some issues between the relationship within adults and children. So this might be a reason why children, adolescents, and youth are not feeling supported. They do not have a support network, and they might be feeling left alone. They also feel, of course, there are spiritual reasons. So there's a spiritual imbalance or probably bad spirits also going on that are affecting adolescents and youth. And also an important one to mention, I think, is there's also some hypothesis around that there is that the high risk for forced recruitment or association with armed forces and armed groups, illegal armed groups, is one of the reasons why adolescents are taking the decision that they rather kill themselves than going into the armed groups or working for the armed groups.
Gosh, yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff for people so young. So this is a really challenging environment for anyone living there and anyone working there and working with these communities. So maybe just talk us through, how did you approach working in this community? What did you do first?
So this whole thing has been a learning process to reach this point. So War Child has been working with indigenous communities, not the specific this one, but with indigenous groups, Waunan and Embera in Chocó, for more than 6 years. So we have created a relationship with the ethnic organizations, with the indigenous authorities, and a close one and a one of collaboration, not one of which we are implementing just some methodologies which are created from Bogota or from Europe, but really working closely with them in creating programs that suit their needs. So we really took the time, and it has been a learning process. And to reach this community, we took the time to actually work and learn with them. To first start with visits to the community. We had after we talked with the leaders and with some people, they invited us to their community meeting. So in this, they have monthly meetings as part of their organizational process in this community. So they invited us there, and they made us explain what the program was about. There is a good part of it, and also from the learning process from War Child, we had a community assistant, which is part of the Waunan community, so speaks the language. So this person was the one who explained what we wanted to do with the community-led child protection approach in this community meeting. They were They were a little bit hesitant at the beginning, to be honest, because it was a very different process, and we were not offering support in sanitation or water or any specific service that we could, as other INGOs did in the place in the past. But they were very happy when they got the concepts to be a part of it. It is, just to briefly mention, we within the project that this was a part of, we had some consultations with the Waunan community to ensure we understood what it meant to be a children for them, and also to understand what it meant to be a man or a woman in those communities according to their law of origin. So this was also important, and of course, working with people from the communities also got us to a better comprehension of what being a children in this kind of community meant, or or how the adults were seeing child protection or just taking care of their children.
Yeah. So what I'm getting from what you're saying is a big part of it was really just taking the time to get to know each other, being clear that unlike the UNHCR or whichever aid agency they may have experienced before, you weren't bringing food or any infrastructure. And then also taking the time to really learn and not make assumptions about what it means to be a child in this particular community, or a man or a woman, or what is childhood. So that's a really a sort of hallmark feature in a way of a lot of community-led work, is as NGO workers, we put aside our assumptions, I guess, of thinking that we understand a community and take the time. So that set the scene then for some kind of activity, action. I think you've said to me in the past, and certainly with community-led work, a big part of it is giving that decision-making power back to a community, as opposed to the NGO deciding what's going to be done and when. So how did that go where you were working? What did they decide to do? And what was the experience of this sort of giving over of power back to the community?
Thank you, Lucy, for that question. I think this is the key part of a community-led process, and it actually takes more from the agency itself than it takes from the community, usually, because the community is used to leading processes. They have their own ways, and it is just that there's a clear power relationship between an INGO coming to a community. When an INGO comes with a program, the community usually feels that this is what is needed and what should be done. So it takes a little bit more of reflection from our side than from the side of the communities. Just to go a little bit around the process, I will say that we were lucky enough to have one person as a community coach, which is the role that we have in our specific methodology for community-led child protection, which is SEEDS, which was very familiar to community work. He had been working in the past in community-led organizations. So we were lucky enough to have this person, and also to have the community assistant from the Waunan community, which led the community and also helped them reflect in their own language and by their own ways throughout this process. So this community is very organized. They have regular meetings. They have their own way of leadership, which is it is all. They have a governor. They have a leader from the indigenous guard, and they have traditional also positions in the community, which which we used and were not used, but which was very much the way of how we gathered community reflection processes. So this specific community went through a participatory reflection process of what were the concerns that they had for children, including community In this process, they included community mappings, they did problem trees, they did transit walks, focus groups, and interviews. And these were all led by community facilitators, which were part of the community and which were completely volunteer. They were volunteers and they were working for their community and at the time that they were able to. So this all followed the times of the community, not our schedules from the agency. They in this process they identified many harms to children, including harsh disciplines. They included also lots of risk associated to accidents. For example, when they were going to the bathroom close to the river, or where they were walking a little bit through the woods or playing, or they identified these kind of risks. Also, around manage of garbage, trash, they identified that there's not a clear, at least there's not a good service provided to manage trash in this community from the municipality. And they weren't used to do this in their previous setting because, of course, they didn't use many plastics or metals or these kind of things. So they didn't have a way of disposing this or cleaning the community. So this is also something that they identified as risky, not only because the children could harm themselves, but also because there were the fumes and the environmental concerns around plastic and metals and all these kind of things could do to children when they were small and when they were growing up. So they, through this reflection process, they identified that there was not a lot of supervision around the children and around how they were playing or when they were going to the bathroom. And they were the ones who decided that it was a problem. So this was one of the problems that they prioritized. They also reflected around how dangerous the neighborhood around the next door neighborhood was, and which is the one that I told you that had presence of armed groups and there are lots of issues around violence. So they decided that one of the problems was that children needed to be a little bit more supervised, or they needed to be a little bit more with the children to ensure their safety.
So what I understand is that you're saying that sort of child rearing in this community traditionally doesn't have like a high level of supervision of the kids during the day. So they'll just be going around playing and doing all the things that kids do. But I'm understanding that because they were displaced and living in a sort of quasi-urbanized environment, this kind of had a whole new set of dangers. And these unsupervised children were now kind of having accidents and things like that because they were living like they lived previously in a tropical forest, but now they've got rubbish tips and other people around in a not very good neighborhood. Is that what was happening?
Exactly. Yeah, that's and the interesting part of it is that they were the ones who were reflecting on it and wondering how to work out a solution around this.
Yeah, really interesting. So they saw a problem that was very specific to the way that they live with their children and where they live in the context now. I think what's interesting is this idea of you saying before that they're very organized and that you kind of went in with this strengths-based approach instead of going and saying, oh, this is a problem, you don't have this, you don't do that. You kind of asked people as a community, what do you do? And maybe you could explain a bit about what kind of structural mechanism in the end they sort of identified that was part of this whole activity that they decided to do.
Sure. This is very interesting because after they learned and reflected around all these risks that there were the children were dealing with in the community, they went on to design or develop an action plan to work around this. Um, and what they found is that they already had some mechanisms that could work or that could be improved to ensure the children were protected. So they did make use of the indigenous guard, which in this community there's a lucky coincidence or a very interesting coincidence is that they think the indigenous guard as also not only the ones that take care of the community, but also the ones who take care of the territory. So also of the environment. And the surroundings and these kind of things. So they identified that this indigenous guards was important to lead the process or to be part of the process. So they involved this indigenous guard. They used this indigenous guard to ensure that at least there was someone around, or that they will be ensuring that there was someone around when children were going to the bathroom, which is not that typical Western bathroom, but it is they go to the bathroom close to the river. So they were ensuring that there was someone around. The indigenous guard was the one who led the process of cleaning of the territory, of trash, but also of all things that could be harmful to children. Also, in these community monthly meetings that I told you about, they managed to ensure that most of the people will be involved in an action plan of building a bridge to ensure that the children could close this small river, could go through this small river without making any harm to them. This was all done and led by them, so it wasn't us providing any support or materials, but it was all self implemented and designed. Um, I think that was the main thing that they organized. And the nice and interesting thing about this is that they kept following up of the actions that they developed through those monthly meetings. So it wasn't just that they will discuss this when we were around or where we asked them to discuss it, because it's not the way we work with. It's basically they were discussing it by themselves on the community monthly meetings, and they will invite us and also discuss around any barriers or anything that was going on that they weren't happy with our support or our implementation.
Wow, interesting. So, just for people listening, Juan Jose, who are not familiar with this, the context where you're working and this idea of an indigenous guard, can you just give us a very brief history of what is the history of this indigenous guard and who actually within a community would be a member of that indigenous guard?
That is an interesting question. I think I will be very brief around it, and also there's lots of information around this, which could be searched further. But the indigenous guard goes back to indigenous communities defending um, from the colonial practices from European, well, in Colombia mostly Spain, but also afterwards from the post-colonial society. So the people who were, the white people who were trying to colonize these territories for crops or for and setting their houses or anything. There was, of course, after the colonial invasion, there was still the indigenous communities got the worst part even after that. And so they designed this mechanism to protect themselves. It is a non-violent mechanism, so it is a non-army mechanism of protection. It is more of a community way of protecting their communities. So they talk to the people who are, for example, thinking of building something around, and they try to explain why the territory is important, or try to make some protests around this, or civic actions around this. So this goes way back, and the interesting there is differences between every indigenous group in Colombia on how they structure their indigenous guards, but they are entitled to by constitution to have those. And the Waunan specifically is a very Pacific indigenous guard. It is a very it is very much oriented to environmental care, to working around the climate crisis, and to working around taking care of their community without being an army structure or a violent structure. So they do not commit any acts of violence, to be clear on that.
Really interesting. And would it be men who are in this guard, or is it men and women? And what sort of age would they be?
Okay, it is evolving. I have to be honest about this. When I have most of the indigenous guards I have known are composed mostly of men, but now there are some which are also women involved in the indigenous guards. And especially in the Waunan community, and especially in this one, they are very young people. So they try to use this as a way of getting young people connected to their ways of seeing the world, through their love of origin. So when I say young people, I say like 20 years old, 23, 22, and they switch the indigenous guard almost every year, if I'm not mistaken. So it is not a stable indigenous guard who will be the same people around all the time, but it is more that the whole community needs to be involved in it to make sure it keeps going and it works.
Wow, so that's really interesting. So in fact, this indigenous guard idea that exists within this community serves a lot of different purposes. But what's interesting is that they took this existing mechanism that's clearly really deeply embedded in their society, and then used it, kind of extended it for child protection more specifically. But what I think is also interesting for me is that if the people who are the indigenous guard are very young, it's kind of a youth-led initiative in a way as well. So not only is it community-led, but it's also very youth-led, which is quite exciting, because we're always looking for examples of youth-led or child-led child protection, which are quite rare to find, especially ones that actually are sustainable and carry on. So it sounds like this one is a little bit that.
It is definitely an interesting mechanism, which I think it's worth to look out more.
And I mean, it makes me want to ask the question. So, okay, War Child Holland are engaging with this community and supporting this process, and I guess trying to take a back seat and kind of help facilitate a process which is very much led by that community, and it seems like led quite strongly also by the young people in that community. So if War Child Holland was to depart from that community next month, do you think that these activities and this way of doing things for the children now would continue? So it's this question about sustainability.
I think this is one of the most interesting questions. I will say yes. I will say that it is likely that they will continue. I'm not 100% certain about it, but I do feel it is very different from a typical way of working, where we will do, let's say, 10 sessions on child rights, on how to help seeking behavior, or community roots or roots. It is different. We are not working through sessions. We have a more constant dialogue and more constant reflections with the community. It is also very important to say that there wasn't any external mechanism or any alternative committee that was created through this process. So basically, they are working with what they already had. They just reflected themselves to include a little bit more of a child protection component in these mechanisms that they already had. So it is, I think, in that sense, that it could be sustainable. They did the action plan by themselves, so we were just reflecting with them, making powerful questions to make them reflect, but we weren't suggesting any action or any risks that should be prioritized. So it was done by them. They even decided how they wanted to close the process, which was with a big community vote, which is a big soup that we usually do here in Colombia for community processes. It is more, this is important. It is more that they empowered themselves more than we empowered them. It wasn't us the ones who were empowering them; it was themselves working through this process, and we provided tools and tools and some trainings at the beginning for the community facilitators to ensure that they could lead this process. And we also mentored and worked through them with this throughout the process. It is interesting to say, and this is not ensuring completely sustainability, but for example, when we were going through this process, we follow a six phases for SEEDS, which is our community-led child protection intervention. So we do preparation, then we do a learning phase with the community led by them. We design the action plan, we implement it, we reflect around the action plan, and we decide how we want to exit. We were going through these phases, and when they were wondering about risks, they were mentioning many things which wouldn't fall specifically under a child protection category. But they will say, okay, there's the roof of this small school in the community, which is broken. We need to fix it. And they did fix it. It was more that they got through the process of reflecting, finding what were the issues of the community that were going on, and trying to find a solution by themselves. So that showed that this could have a it's very promising on sustainability. I will say we need to keep an eye on what happens next and still get in contact with the community to see how this goes in the future. But I do have great hopes for sustainability.
Yeah, it sounds really promising. And I like how you said that they empowered themselves and kind of almost got motivation to do other things, which maybe wouldn't be typically considered child protection, but were still things which contributed to the well-being of the kids and the community, like fixing the school roof. For me, that's amazing, because who are we to say, don't do this? And I think that's partly one of the challenges we have when we say we work in child protection in an NGO. We feel that the actions under our project must always kind of fit into that category. But if you are more kind of, I guess you were more sort of flexible and open-minded about what a community might want to do as part of their actions, and that it may not be technically child protection per se, but it kind of contributed more generally to the community, and that they were inspired to do it. So for me, that's a really amazing story. And, you'd hope that this could be something that might be repeated in other communities and that would hopefully continue, into the future. I think it's interesting, this whole idea of sort of wanting to control people when you're part of a project and you've got money to address a very specific issue and you must report to the donor. We want to create everything in categories. And of course, people living on the ground, any person doesn't really think like that. When I do something for my own child, I'm not thinking, oh, this is child protection, or oh, this is education. You're just doing the best you can for your child's well-being. And that's probably a more realistic reflection of how communities work with their kids. And it seems like the example you gave is kind of a good example, or good way of illustrating how that can happen. Let me ask you a question, Juan Jose. I've got a bit lost now in the thing. The good thing is we can edit this. We can say whatever we like. But by the way, if you ever feel like you want to repeat something, just repeat it, because I'll just edit out the one that you don't like.
Okay.
So I kind of had to ask you a question. I think the problem is, because we've got this bit here where we say, yes, very difficult to break down power. This is what you say. So let me ask you a question like kind of trusting the community. Shall I ask you something around that?
Yeah.
And then you can use this. Okay, so Juan Jose, when we work in communities as agencies, NGOs, or outside people, I think sometimes there's this mindset, which is that we don't really trust the community to do what's best for their children, and that there's lots of child protection problems, and that's why we're here, and we're going to try and educate people and teach them about child rights and try and get a community to change the way it treats its children and to reduce the amount of abuse or neglect or whatever the particular problem is in that community that we perceive to be the problem. How do you approach that from this alternative community-led way of working?
Thank you, Lucy. Very, very interesting. I will say it is a very difficult question to address. We need to think further about the power relationship that we established when we were thinking that we are the ones who know what are the child protection problems, what are the child protection issues or risks in a community. And why are we thinking that we know better than the community? I think there's a reflection to be done there, especially from our side, from our agency side. I think we really need to accept that what communities feel and think and want to do usually is right, and they usually want to take care of children, and they usually care about their children correctly. So there's a perception in our sector that indigenous people do not take care of the children, or that they have harmful practices against children. And I will want to say that this is really not the case. It is because we do not take enough time to learn about how these groups function, work with them through these. We do both have harmful practices. So our Western society does have also harmful practices. They do have harmful practices. And I think the way of changing this, it is not that we should take a moral superiority position or a power position to say like, okay, what you're doing is wrong, let's do it this way. We really need to work together with them and reflect so they can get those reflections that we have also done in our Western society on why some practices are not good for children, and to ensure that they can do their own change, not through our ways, but by their own ways. And in this way, it will be more sustainable, and not just that they will do it because we are there, and after we leave, they will immediately switch back to the way they used to be.
Yeah. So really this idea of trusting the community, going in with this mindset where you trust that most people want what's best for their children, which sounds obvious, but I'm not sure it's that obvious when you look at how traditionally an agency might enter a community and the very reasons that they're there. We're there because there's a problem. But I wanted us to maybe explore this idea and unpack a bit further this idea of what changed. So you said the community identified that the way the low levels of supervision that they had for their children during the day when they were out playing or using the bathroom or whatever it may be, they decided that was inadequate because the children were experiencing accidents and different kinds of dangers. So if you were to unpack that a bit more, like what really was the key motivation to make people in a community have this communal revelation or decision about something that needed to change? What do you think contributed to that?
I think it was just getting together to talk about it and discuss it, because they might be thinking, this might be the case, but this is my hypothesis. There was someone who might be thinking of this, but didn't think that many people in their community might be also thinking of this. So I think that participatory process of deep learning about the context, led by them and ensuring an inclusive process. So also listening to children, also listening to adolescents, adults, people with disabilities, traditional authorities, which are also important, and then getting all these results from these small groups and getting into a big community discussion led them to think, okay, we might be thinking the same, but we hadn't discussed it in the past. So that was, I think, a good and interesting. It might be the reason why they got to this point. Of course, there were other issues raised in the group. So there was issues around child marriage. There were issues around possible sexual violence that were addressed in the learning phase. Those weren't the ones that the community prioritized. They were thinking that they were more of a case, specific cases. We had a referral system also in place in the implementation to ensure that if there was any case coming out, we could answer to it. I do think that these complicated issues such as sexual violence, child exploitation, child marriage can be worked and can be addressed through a community-led process. It just takes time, and it just takes time for the community to really make the reflection that these are the issues that are affecting the most the children at this specific community. For instance, we have a current implementation ongoing in the northern part of Colombia, where we're working around child exploitation through a community-led process. So these traditional, not tradition, but these important topics that you would think when going to a community for a child protection intervention can also be addressed through a community-led process. So it is not only that it needs to be decided by the agency, they can also do this.
Yeah, really fascinating. I mean, it's a great example of the difference between what we might call an agency-driven approach and what this is, which you could also call a facilitation approach. So we can't force the community to address issues which aren't a priority for them. And giving people this kind of space and the tools. And when we say tools, we mean like skills, methods, ways of thinking more deeply about what concerns them, what's important to them, and for their children. And also what I thought was really interesting is because I've had this discussion with other people about what does it mean, the concept of community ownership. And one thing that always comes up for me is this idea of shared values is part of it, that if people within a community have shared values, then they can come together around a particular issue. And what you said was really interesting, which was actually people did share quite a lot of values and also concerns, but they hadn't actually got together to talk about it until this process happened, whereby they spent a lot of time talking and they actually went, a lot of us are thinking the same thing. So it wasn't even that people had to change their minds. It's just they had to realize they weren't the only one thinking this. I found that very interesting.
It is fascinating. And I think just to say a brief thing about Colombia's context, I think it's one of the things, this social connectedness, it's one of the most affected things by the armed conflict in our country. So it also goes around that.
That's interesting. So you're saying the conflict sort of broke a lot of the social connectedness. You touched on this need for safeguarding. You mentioned having referral systems in place, that there was abuse, there are other protection issues for children. So it wasn't that you were, as an agency, just ignoring everything or anything that happened there. There was a plan to support children who were experiencing certain kinds of child protection harms. Could you talk a bit more about how you approached this safeguarding issue and how you did it? And was it the same as how we would do it normally in a more agency-led approach?
Thank you, Lucy. This is one which we had a learning process. So we had a first pilot before this implementation, and we took a more formal approach, a more agency-driven approach of we could have some issues of safeguarding during the implementation, which are of course associated with the organization, with the volunteers working for it, for the process, or the community coach. And we did trainings and all, but this I feel wasn't the right approach, and I feel it wasn't a community-led approach. So we had some internal discussions with our amazing child safeguarding global advisors and with research, with Rinske, the research lead for the SEEDS process. And we ended up with a more, I will say, community-friendly approach to safeguarding, where we just put some questions on the initial discussions and ensure that there is some sort of agreements on how to keep children safe during all the activities that SEEDS will have. So through the learning phase, through the design of the action plan, to implementation, at the closing events. They got to some agreements which were proposed by them, not by us. And they got a way of just discussing around if these agreements were being completed, or if there were anything that needed to be discussed around these monthly meetings. So this is how we handle it. And I feel it's more it is more a participatory and community-led approach to safeguarding than just making them sign our policy and doing trainings, which is the traditional way of doing it.
So you kind of had to adapt the safeguarding policy and way that it was implemented into a more community-led way. I think a lot of people do, when we talk about community-led child protection, often people will say, oh, but what about safeguarding? And is it sort of an anything goes approach? Which it's not.
And I think it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. There are SOPs which we're still following as an organization. There's our safeguarding policy where we are we still followed. So we're still, if there was any case referral or anything, we will immediately get some action. We had all the channels of reporting available for the community, which were also shared by us. So there was all these procedures in place to ensure safety, safeguarding of children.
That's really interesting. Okay, so maybe let's think a bit more now about the idea of inclusivity. And I wanted to explore that with you in this context. How did you approach being inclusive? What were the challenges and how did you do things?
I think this is one of the principles of this process, the whole process, to ensure that it is an inclusive process, which means we wanted to include the visions and also the opinions of children, adults, LGBTQ plus community, people with disabilities, women who have been historically marginalized also. So I want to this is a principle of our implementation. One point where we made some, I will say the only point where we made some influence around this is we asked the community to think if the traditional leaders or the community leaders will be the best people to select to be a facilitator in the process. So for these volunteer positions, and we really encourage people to think of people who have the time or who do not have a power relationship with the community. Because if we pick, for example, an indigenous governor as a community facilitator, then people will tend to do what he or she says in the community. This will also happen in a traditional Western community, that if we pick the community leader from the neighborhood and this is the person who is leading the process, they will probably tend to follow this person because of the way that community works. So we ended up, and this was very, very interesting, we ended up with a participatory process to select the community facilitators, in which we asked many of the people in the community who they think could be. And we ended up with a nice mixture of young facilitators, one who was part of the Indigenous Guard. There was one there was one woman who was a professor. There was another adolescent woman. And I think there was an adult from the community in this group. So we ended up with a group of facilitators who were not from the same age, not from the same levels of power, but who weren't in a very powerful position in the community and who were organically could go to a stronger leadership position. It is important, and this is also something that we do weekly reflection processes with community facilitators. On which tools we should use with children, which tools we should use with adults, and community facilitators, which are part of the community, decided that community mappings would work great for children, that adults and children could work together on doing problem trees. They also decided that transect walks were amazing and they want to do it with everyone. So that's one of the participatory methodologies for the learning phase, which was more used, and they will do it by going with a group of people throughout the community and talking to other people, and just finding out what they were thinking around risks for children. I think, and I think the importance of letting this learning phase go through a participatory approach and with inclusivity in mind is that when they met all the community, they had results from many different groups of population within that community that needed to be discussed and addressed in a big community meeting. So they had the issues that children wanted to raise, they had the issues that women wanted to raise, they had all the issues that the authorities also wanted to take into account. And they went around this and prioritized them all together. So people who were not used to saying something in the meetings or to having their thoughts or preoccupations addressed in the meetings were also able to put those in the table there. So it was pretty great. For instance, when I had the opportunity to attend those meetings, it was pretty impressive because I saw children presenting what they found through the learning phase, through the risk, and they had their map and they showed where they were feeling that there were more danger, what kind of dangers they were feeling, which risks they were feeling in those places. And the whole community was just listening and being really attentive of what the children were saying.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. So just continuing on about inclusivity, Juan Jose, you told me this really good story the other day about inclusivity in this community and how they took up this concept quite seriously, and it actually changed the way they did their cooking. Can you tell us that story?
Thank you, Lucy. No, that's a nice story that I have and that we have from the implementation on that community. And is that it is usual that when we organize community pots, so these big soups that are cooked for all the community, that the women will be the ones who were cooking, and maybe while they were cooking, the men could discuss the issues that the organization wants to discuss. So we actually, at the beginning of the implementation, we made some questions around this, and we kept going on about reflections around the importance of the whole community participating. And at the end of the implementations, we were going through phase 6, which is closing and deciding how War Child will live the community, and deciding a little bit on sustainability. They mentioned that they wanted to do a community plot for the closure. And when we were, all the team was there. I was there as a child protection technical advisor. There was the community coach. There were the community facilitators. Some other people from the War Child office also there, but also all the community, more importantly. They were both. So it was not only the women who were cooking at this closing event. So it was men also supporting and helping and going through it. But actually, what they suggested is that we waited until we had the food, and then we could have the meeting with the whole community. And this was their suggestion, not ours. So it meant that this reflection got through with them, and they felt that now it was important to include our community. It was. This is I think a fun, interesting story. It doesn't mean that we completely change and transform gender roles in the community, which I think takes more time, but definitely showed that they were reflecting around it, and that they say, okay, these people are asking about his participation. Let's try to be more participative this time.
Yeah, really interesting. Good story. So if you, Juan Jose, were gonna give us 3 kind of key takeaways, 3 things that anyone listening here today could take with them around this community-led process that you've been part of in this indigenous community, what would you want to highlight for us?
Sure, Lucy. I think the most important is that there's a mind shift that needs to take place, and this mind shift takes time. So, to enable communities to have the power and to do reflection within your agency really takes time. There needs to be reflection starting from senior management of a country level office or even the global office of an NGO. To even the community facilitators, the people who are volunteers from the community, on what it really means to let the community drive the process and lead this process. Another one is to trust the process, so not get impatient. So it's really just being patient. There might be moments where a child protection technical advisor or a community coach, in our case, will want to interfere with the community decisions or times, and this might be you because you have a very complicated planning that you need to finish this implementation in 6 months, 9 months, or something around that, or you have some goals to achieve. But I think what is important is to reflect on what it is that is making you want to influence or feel that you have the correct answer to approaching one barrier that is showing up in the implementation. So what reflect on the agency side, reflection on why do we think that we know better than the community, and what makes us think that if we say that they should do this, it will be better, or rather than discussing and reflecting with them through the process, which I think it's the best way to go. And I think another one, it is that people really feel validated and take on the role as a protective and caring community when they go through a deep reflection process around the risk that children are facing in the community. They work around with the whole community to prioritize some of this that they want to work at the beginning. They might work on other ones later. They do plans for themselves, and they do the actions for themselves, and also reflect on the results of this. They really feel validated. They really feel empowered, and there's really a difference, if I can say it that way, when they are presenting you what they have done, that when you are leading them to do something and you're just looking at what they do.
Wow, thanks for that. So here's a final question. Juan Jose, in the future, do you think that you will ever be able to use the old-fashioned, typical community-based approach for child protection again, or what's your feeling on that?
Oh, that's a complicated one. I will say yes. I will say that I'm more inclined to working towards a community-led and ensuring that there's a way of working in most contexts in a community-led manner. But I will say that there's still some emergencies or some immediate actions that are needed to be done in the traditional or community-based approach, which are valuable and can get to good results also. So it's not a definite no, but I do have a tendency to work through more long-term processes and community-led processes.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's good to remind ourselves that maybe not every context is the best context for a community-led approach, but that we shouldn't go in with our minds made up. You still need to go in and kind of assess that context and decide what might be the best approach and go in with an open mind. But the other thing I wanted to say to you was when you describe this process, it kind of sounds so beautiful and like not easy, but sort of, something that comes naturally. But I know from what you've told me and also from other practitioners that, this is a long process that requires a lot of commitment, and you've got to be quite brave. You've got to stick by your beliefs. And you said at the end, we've got to trust the process. That is easier said than done often. And I don't know if you feel the
Definitely.
same way.
I do feel the same way, and I want to be honest around this. It is not that it's a perfectly smooth running process. It is a very nice one, and you get through lots of learnings, but you also get through barriers and moments where you're thinking, oh, I should just make a plan and do them and wonder and discuss with them if this is the best way to go. But then you need to let go that temptation. That is important. And also just trust that they are in a reflecting process and trust that not all communities have the same time, the same way of time management, or the same way of planning, or the same way of going around issues. So there are communities that have more difficulties discussing some specific issues, and this could be also going through structural problems in our society. So gender violence, sexual violence, some communities take more time to discuss it, and you might be frustrated too if they are not. But trust the process; they will get there. It is, I think, an important skill that we have in our training to learn to do powerful questions and learn to really do reflective practice through this process to address the barriers, to see also to make always to put the solution always in the minds and of the people, not in yours. So the solution comes from them; it doesn't come from you. You can also see the problem and you can openly discuss it with them, but they will be the ones who will find the solution, and there's going to be a solution from the community. It just takes time. So so trust the process, and don't get too impatient.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And one of the main reasons of doing these podcasts even was because I'm very aware that there's a lot of practitioners out there who want to try some level of sort of community-led work and use that approach more, but sometimes people get lost in the process or feel not confident, or that they're not making progress. And these podcasts and hearing you say what you've just said and explain how you went about doing this is also, I hope, a bit of inspiration and encouragement to anyone who's listening who feels that what they're doing right now is not really working. That you have to stick at it and trust the process. It's really nice to hear that. What I'm understanding is that War Child Holland in Colombia is just part of a much bigger global initiative by War Child Holland to try and promote and roll out this community-led approach. And you've been testing it and in Colombia, and also getting some advice and support from Rinska at the global level.
Yes, it is. It is a shared methodology with Save the Children International. There are currently many pilots ongoing around the world. We did a feasibility study around this methodology in 2020, and we are planning on an evaluation for this year or next year to ensure that it is proven that it does what we feel it does, which we trust it does.
Great. Looking forward to reading about that. So with that, Juan Jose, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's your morning. Here it's the end of the day, and good old Johannesburg, the lights have just gone off.
Lights out.
So thank you very much for taking that time. It's really, really appreciated. And just hearing what you've learnt, it's very, very rich.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for inviting me. Also, always available for discussions or for questions or anything around our implementation and our way to see a community-led child protection.
That's great. And just for anyone who's listening now, if you go to the Child Protection Exchange website, there is a page dedicated to this episode, and there's a whole lot of photos, links to resources. Some of them are in Spanish, but some of them are in English, and you can follow up on some of the things that we discussed today around working in this community in Colombia. Thank you so much, Juan José. This podcast was made possible thanks to the Child Resilience Alliance with a grant from Oak Foundation. It was produced and hosted by myself, Lucy Hillier, of the Community Child Protection Exchange. Original music was composed and performed by Jay Bones. Thanks, and see you next time.